I grew up in a house where money was always spoken about in hushed, careful tones, as if saying the numbers too loudly might make them disappear. My parents were not poor, but they were never satisfied. Every decision, every argument, every strained family visit somehow circled back to the same topic: Grandpa's house, Grandpa's land, Grandpa's savings. It was like he wasn't a person to them anymore, just a future transaction waiting to happen. Grandpa lived alone in the old family home at the edge of town, a place that smelled like old books, sandalwood soap, and the faint sweetness of the mango tree in the backyard. When I was little, I loved visiting him. He would sit in his armchair by the window, reading with his glasses slipping down his nose, and look up with a soft smile that made me feel like I mattered in a way I didn't feel at home. My parents called him stubborn and difficult, but I only ever saw a gentleman who moved slower each year and spoke more carefully, as if every word needed to be chosen with care. We used to visit him as a family when I was younger, mostly on holidays or when relatives were around and appearances had to be maintained. My mother would bring sweets she knew he couldn't eat because of his diabetes, placing them on the table with a bright smile while reminding him loudly that she had made the effort. My father would walk through the house, glancing at the walls, the cabinets, the land outside, as if measuring everything in his head. They always left early, claiming they were busy, but the moment we got into the car, the conversation shifted. "Did you see the size of that backyard?" My father would say, starting the engine. "If it gets divided, it's still worth a lot." My mother would nod, adjusting her dupatta and sighing. "Your sister is definitely going to try and take a bigger share. You know how she is." I sat in the back seat, hugging the small tin of cookies Grandpa had secretly slipped into my bag, listening to them talk about him like he was already gone. At first, I didn't understand. I thought adults just spoke like that when they were stressed. But as I grew older, the pattern became impossible to ignore. They rarely asked how he was feeling or whether he needed anything. They only cared about what he might leave behind. By the time I turned 14, our visits had become less frequent. Months would pass without my parents mentioning Grandpa at all. Then suddenly, my father would remember him and decide we should go see him. The trips always felt tense, like we were actors stepping onto a stage to perform a role we had practiced too many times. Grandpa's house, however, never changed. The curtains were always drawn halfway to keep the sunlight soft, his radio quietly playing old songs in the background. He would light up when he saw me, pulling me into a slow, careful hug. My parents would sit stiffly on the sofa, asking polite but distant questions. "So, have you been taking your medicines?" My mother would ask, her voice carrying a fake sweetness. Grandpa would nod. "Yes, yes. Your daughter reminds me every time she calls." That was another thing that set me apart from the rest of the family. I called him. At first, it had been something my teacher suggested when we were asked to check in on elderly relatives during a school project. I had dialed his number nervously, expecting the call to be awkward and short. Instead, we ended up talking for almost an hour about his childhood, the games he used to play, and the stories behind the old photographs in his living room. After that, I kept calling. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Grandpa never rushed me off the phone. He listened when I complained about school, laughed when I told him about my friends, and always ended our conversations by saying, "You make the house feel less empty, Beta." My parents noticed eventually. One evening, my mother glanced at me while I was on the phone in the living room and said in a low voice to my father, "She's getting too attached." "It's not healthy." I pretended not to hear, but her words stayed with me. Too attached. As if loving your own grandfather was something dangerous, something that needed to be controlled. As Grandpa grew older, small signs of his declining health started to show. He moved slower. His hands shook when he poured tea, and sometimes he forgot the thread of a story halfway through telling it. I would notice these things and mention them at home, hoping my parents would be concerned. "He seemed tired today," I told my mother once. "Maybe we should take him to a better doctor." She shrugged without looking up from her phone. "He's old. That's what happens." "But he was coughing a lot," I insisted. My father sighed loudly from the sofa. We can't force him to do anything, and anyway, he has enough money to take care of himself. That sentence, more than anything, made me feel a cold, heavy disappointment I didn't yet have the words to describe. It wasn't that they thought he was fine. It was that they believed his money was a substitute for their presence. So I started visiting him on my own. At first, my parents resisted, saying it was unsafe for me to travel alone across town. But when I pointed out that they were too busy to go with me, they eventually stopped arguing. I would take the bus after school, walk the familiar cracked pavement to his gate, and let myself in with the spare key he had given me. Those afternoons became the calmest part of my week. I would help him with small chores, read his letters out loud when his eyesight was too strained, and cook simple meals under his patient guidance. He taught me how to make his favorite lentil soup and how to check if rice was perfectly cooked just by listening to the sound of the pot. In return, he told me stories about my grandmother, about how they built the house together brick by brick, about the dreams he once had for his children. He never spoke badly about my parents, but sometimes his silence said more than words could. When I mentioned that they were busy or that they had planned to visit, but couldn't make it, he would just nod and smile faintly, as if he had expected nothing different. One evening, as we sat in the backyard watching the sun dip behind the mango tree, he said quietly, "People show you who they are not by what they say, but by what they do when they think no one is keeping score." I didn't fully understand what he meant at the time, but I felt the sadness in his voice. I leaned my head against his shoulder, and he patted my hand gently, the way he used to when I was little. Back at home, my parents started noticing the changes in me. I talked about Grandpa more often, defended him when they made dismissive comments, and refused to laugh when they joked about who would get which room in his house after he was gone. "You're being dramatic," my mother told me once. "This is just how families talk. You'll understand when you're older." But I already understood more than they thought. I understood that to them, Grandpa's life was slowly shrinking into a number on a future bank statement. To me, he was still the man who saved the last piece of cake for me, who remembered my exam dates better than my own parents, and who kept every drawing I had ever made pinned carefully to his refrigerator. The older I got, the clearer the difference became between us. They visited him out of obligation and calculation. I visited him out of love. And although none of us said it aloud, I could feel something building beneath the surface of our family, something tense and fragile, like a thread pulled too tight that would eventually snap. I just didn't know yet how loudly it would break, or how many lives would be changed when it finally did. By the time I turned 19, Grandpa's health had begun to decline in ways that were impossible for anyone to ignore. The strength that once made him seem quietly unshakable was fading, replaced by a frailty that showed in the way he held onto furniture when he walked and how often he needed to sit down to catch his breath. His voice, once steady and warm, had grown softer, sometimes dissolving into a whisper that forced me to lean closer just to hear him. I was in my second year of university when I started spending even more time at his house. I arranged my schedule so I could visit him 3 or 4 times a week, often going straight from campus to his place with my backpack still slung over my shoulder. The house felt different now, quieter, heavier, as though the walls themselves knew something was coming that none of us wanted to name out loud. Grandpa had always been independent, stubborn even, refusing help for as long as he could. But slowly, he began to accept my assistance with things he once handled easily. I cooked most of his meals, sorted his medications into labeled boxes, and reminded him gently when it was time to take them. He would sometimes grumble about losing his freedom, but he never pushed me away. One afternoon, as I helped him sit down on the edge of his bed after he had grown dizzy in the kitchen, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something between gratitude and regret. "You shouldn't have to do all this at your age," he said quietly. "Your parents should be here." I hesitated, unsure how to respond. I had stopped making excuses for them months ago, but I also didn't want to upset him by speaking the truth too bluntly. "They're busy," I said finally, the familiar lie tasting bitter on my tongue. He studied my face for a moment, then gave a tired smile. Boozy people still find time for what matters. That evening, I called my mother and told her grandpa had almost fallen. There was a pause on the line before she spoke. Did he hurt himself? No, but he was really shaky. I think he needs someone with him more often. She sighed, the sound heavy with annoyance rather than concern. We can't just drop everything and move in with him. You know your father's work schedule. I'm not saying that, I replied, trying to stay calm. But maybe we should look into getting him a nurse, or at least visiting more regularly. We'll see, she said quickly, which I had learned was her way of ending a conversation without committing to anything. As the weeks passed, Grandpa's condition worsened. His appetite faded. His hands trembled more noticeably, and he grew forgetful in small but frightening ways. Once, he left the stove on after trying to make tea. Another time, he forgot the name of his own childhood friend while telling me a story he had shared a dozen times before. I started staying overnight occasionally, sleeping on the old sofa in the living room so I could hear him if he needed help during the night. My parents didn't protest. In fact, they seemed almost relieved that I had taken on the responsibility they had been quietly avoiding. It was during one of those quiet nights that Grandpa first brought up his will. We were sitting at the dining table, the only light in the house coming from the small lamp above us. I was helping him sort through a stack of old papers he had kept in a wooden drawer for years, receipts, letters, faded photographs. His fingers moved slowly over the documents, as if each one carried a memory he wasn't ready to let go of. I met with the lawyer last week, he said suddenly, not looking up. My hand stilled on the paper I was holding. About what? My will, he replied simply. A strange tension settled in my chest. I had known, of course, that he must have made one at some point, but hearing him say it out loud made everything feel more real, more final. You didn't have to tell me, I said gently. That's private. He chuckled softly. At my age, nothing feels private anymore. Everyone is just waiting. I knew who he meant. My parents had grown noticeably more attentive in recent months, calling him more often and even visiting twice in 1 month, which was rare for them. But their kindness felt rehearsed, their smiles too wide, their questions too focused on practical matters like property papers and bank accounts. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, his breathing slightly labored. Do you know why I wanted to talk to you about it? I shook my head. Because you're the only one who never asked about it, he said. Not once. You never asked what I would leave behind or who would get what. You just came. His words made my throat tighten. I looked down at my hands, unsure how to respond without crying. I didn't come for anything, I whispered. I came because you're my grandpa. He reached across the table and placed his frail hand over mine. His skin felt thin and cool, the veins beneath it more visible than ever before. I know, he said softly, and that is why I had to make some difficult decisions. A chill ran through me. What do you mean? He hesitated, as if weighing how much he should reveal. Families can become ugly when money is involved. I have seen it before, even in my own brothers and sisters. I don't want what I leave behind to destroy what little love is left in this family. I swallowed hard. It's your decision, Grandpa. You should do what you think is right. He studied me carefully, his eyes searching my face as though trying to memorize it. No matter what happens after I'm gone, you must remember something. People will show you sides of themselves you never imagined. Do not let their anger make you doubt your own heart. His words felt like a warning wrapped in kindness, and they left me unsettled long after we finished talking. That night, as I lay on the sofa staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. I had always known my parents cared about his money more than they cared about him, but I had never considered that his final decisions might expose that truth in a way none of us could ignore. Over the next few weeks, Grandpa began sharing small stories from his past that he had never told me before. He spoke about the years he spent building his business from nothing, about the sacrifices he and my grandmother made to give their children comfortable lives, and about the disappointment he felt when those same children grew distant once they no longer needed his help. "I don't blame them entirely," he said one afternoon as we sat in the backyard. "People get caught up in their own lives. But forgetting where you came from, that is a choice." I listened quietly, sensing that these stories were not just memories but pieces of a larger confession he was slowly piecing together for me. One day, he asked me to bring him a small metal box from the top shelf of his wardrobe. It was heavier than it looked, and inside were neatly organized folders labeled with dates and names. Legal documents, bank statements, and property papers were stacked inside, each one carefully protected in plastic sleeves. "I want you to know where everything is," he said. "Not because I expect you to use it, but because someone needs to understand how hard it was to earn all of this." As I flipped through the papers, I felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. Pride in the life he had built, and sadness that the people who were supposed to value it the most only seemed interested in its monetary worth. A few days later, my parents called to say they were planning a visit. They arrived carrying fruit baskets and forced smiles, acting as though they had always been attentive children. I watched them from the kitchen as they spoke loudly to Grandpa, asking exaggeratedly about his health and offering to help with things they had ignored for years. When my mother thought I wasn't listening, I heard her whisper to my father, "We should ask him again about the will." Just casually. My stomach twisted. I realized then that Grandpa's fears were not exaggerated. The storm he had been quietly preparing for was already gathering at our doorstep. That evening, after my parents left, Grandpa seemed more tired than usual. He sat in his armchair, staring at the doorway long after they were gone. "They think I don't see through them," he murmured. "But an old man has little to do except observe." I knelt beside him and rested my head against his arm. "You don't have to worry about them tonight. Just rest." He placed his hand gently on my hair. "I am not worried for myself," he said softly. "I am worried for you. Because when the truth comes out, they will not forgive you for something you never asked for." His words lingered in the quiet room, heavy and unshakable. And for the first time, I began to understand that whatever choices he had made in that lawyer's office were not just about money or property. They were about justice, about love, and about forcing our family to face a truth it had been avoiding for years. The day of the will reading arrived on a gray, overcast morning that seemed to press down on the city like a warning. Grandpa had passed away 3 days earlier, quietly in his sleep, his hand resting on the same book he had been pretending to read while I made him tea in the kitchen. The house felt hollow without him, stripped of the warmth that had once made every visit feel safe. Even the ticking of the wall clock sounded louder, more intrusive, as if time itself had become impatient. My parents were the ones who insisted we all attend the will reading together. They spoke about it in practical terms, as if it were just another errand to be completed after the funeral rituals were over. My mother spent extra time choosing what to wear that morning, settling on a dark but elegant outfit, and my father shaved carefully, humming under his breath as though he were preparing for an important meeting, rather than a final gathering tied to his own father's death. We arrived at the lawyer's office 15 minutes early. The building was old and narrow, its corridors lined with faded legal certificates and shelves of thick, dusty files. The receptionist greeted us with a polite nod and asked us to wait in a small conference room. Inside, a long wooden table dominated the space, surrounded by stiff, backed chairs that looked as uncomfortable as the silence that soon settled between us. My aunt and her family arrived shortly after, their eyes scanning the room with barely concealed curiosity. We exchanged brief, formal greetings, the kind reserved for people who were related by blood but separated by years of distance and quiet resentment. No one spoke about Grandpa directly. Instead, they talked about traffic, the weather, and how quickly everything had happened, as though avoiding his name would somehow make the situation less real. I sat at the end of the table, my hands folded tightly in my lap. I felt out of place among the adults, even though I was no longer a child. The air in the room felt heavy with expectation, charged with a kind of nervous excitement that made my stomach churn. My father leaned toward my mother and whispered, not quietly enough, "Let's see how he divided everything. The house alone is worth a fortune now." My mother gave a small, tense smile. "He always said he would be fair. I'm sure he thought of both children equally." I stared at the grain of the wooden table, trying to block out their words. It felt wrong to sit there discussing property values when the memory of Grandpa's last smile was still so fresh in my mind. Just days ago, I had been holding his frail hand, promising him I would water his plants and keep the house clean. Now we were gathered like investors waiting for the outcome of a deal. The lawyer entered the room precisely on time. He was a tall man with silver hair and a calm, measured expression. He greeted each of us by name, his voice professional but not unkind. When he shook my hand, he held it a fraction longer than necessary and gave me a small, sympathetic nod that made my chest tighten. "Thank you all for coming," he said as he took his seat at the head of the table. He placed a thick folder in front of him and adjusted his glasses. "I understand this is a difficult time for your family, and I will do my best to make this process as clear and respectful as possible." My father straightened in his chair, his expression sharpening with focus. My aunt folded her hands neatly, her eyes fixed on the folder, as if she could see through it to the contents inside. The lawyer began by reading out the formal legal language that confirmed Grandpa's identity, his mental state at the time of writing the will, and the date on which it had been signed. His voice was steady, each word carefully pronounced. I listened, but the legal terms blurred together, my mind drifting back to the afternoons I had spent in Grandpa's backyard, listening to him tell stories about his youth. Then the lawyer paused, turning a page. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Your father left a personal letter to be read aloud before the distribution of his estate," he said, looking up at us. He was very clear that he wanted everyone present to hear his own words. A flicker of confusion crossed my parents' faces. My father shifted slightly in his seat. "A letter," he repeated. "Yes," the lawyer replied calmly. He unfolded a separate sheet of paper, its edges slightly worn. "I will read it exactly as it was written." As he began, Grandpa's familiar voice seemed to echo in my mind, each sentence carrying the same quiet firmness he had always used when speaking about serious matters. "To my children and my granddaughter." The lawyer read, "If you are hearing this, then I am no longer there to explain these decisions in person. I know this letter may cause anger, disappointment, and perhaps even shame, but I ask you to listen until the end before reacting." The room fell completely silent. Even the distant sounds from the corridor seemed to fade away. I spent my life working to build something that would give my family security and comfort. The lawyer continued, his voice carrying Grandpa's words with careful precision. "I did this not because I wanted wealth, but because I wanted my children and their children to have opportunities I never had." I saw my aunt shift uncomfortably, her eyes narrowing slightly. My father's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. As the years passed, the letter went on. "I began to notice that my presence in your lives became less important than the things I owned. Visits became rare, phone calls shorter, and concern for my well-being often replaced by questions about my finances." My mother's face flushed, a faint red spreading across her cheeks. She glanced at my father, but he kept his gaze fixed on the lawyer, his expression hardening. "I do not write this to hurt you," the lawyer read, "but to explain why I had to make choices that some of you may find unfair. A parent hopes that their children will care for them in old age out of love, not obligation. I was fortunate to have one person in my life who did exactly that." My heart began to pound. I knew, even before my name was spoken, who he was referring to. My granddaughter visited me when she had no reason to, called me when no one else did, and treated me as a person rather than a future inheritance. She reminded me that kindness still exists in this world, even within a family that had begun to forget it. A sharp inhale came from my aunt's side of the table. My father's hand clenched into a fist. "I want you all to understand that my decisions were not made in anger," the lawyer continued. "They were made in gratitude. Gratitude for the one person who chose me, not my money." The room felt suffocating. I kept my eyes fixed on the table, unable to look at my parents. knowing the weight of their stares would be unbearable. The lawyer paused again, letting the words settle before moving on to the legal distribution of the estate. He outlined how the house, the majority of the savings, and several investments had been left in my name. Smaller amounts were allocated to my father and aunt, but they were a fraction of what they had clearly expected. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was so complete that I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant hum of traffic outside. Then my father let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "This has to be a mistake," he said, his voice rising. "He would never do something like this. He always said he would divide everything equally." The lawyer met his gaze calmly. "Your father updated his will 6 months ago. He was of sound mind and very clear about his wishes." My mother's eyes turned toward me, wide with shock and something darker, something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. "You knew about this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. I shook my head, my throat too tight to form words. "No," I whispered finally. "I didn't." But it didn't matter. In that moment, their disappointment and humiliation needed somewhere to land, and I was the closest target. Around us, the room that had once felt merely uncomfortable now felt like a courtroom, where a verdict had just been delivered. And while the lawyer calmly continued explaining the legal steps that would follow, I realized that the real consequences of Grandpa's letter were only just beginning to unfold, and they would not be contained within those four walls. The lawyer's voice faded into the background as the reality of what had just been read settled over the room like a heavy fog. My parents sat frozen in their chairs, their expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and fury. My aunt's lips were pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting between me and the stack of papers in front of the lawyer as if she were searching for some hidden clause that would undo everything she had just heard. I felt as though the floor beneath me had shifted. I had never imagined that Grandpa would leave me so much, not because I didn't love him, but because I had never seen our relationship as something that could be measured in money. The house where I had spent countless afternoons, the savings he had built over decades, the investments he had mentioned only in passing, all of it now legally tied to my name. Instead of feeling relieved or grateful, I felt exposed, like a spotlight had been switched on in a room where I had always preferred to sit quietly in the corner. My father was the first to speak again. "He was manipulated," he said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the silence. He looked directly at the lawyer. "My daughter was living with him, taking care of him. You don't think that might have influenced his decisions?" The accusation landed like a slap. My stomach twisted, and I felt heat rush to my face. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but no words came out. The lawyer remained composed. "Your father requested that I meet him privately when he made these changes. He was very clear that he did not want anyone else present during those discussions. He explained his reasoning in detail, and I can assure you that he was neither confused nor pressured." My mother let out a shaky breath, her composure beginning to crack. "This is humiliating," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "What will people say when they find out that our own daughter took everything?" I wanted to tell her that I hadn't taken anything, that I had never asked for this, but her words made it clear that in her mind, the damage was already done. To her, appearances mattered more than intentions, and the fact that Grandpa had made his feelings public in a letter made it impossible for her to pretend otherwise. The lawyer continued explaining the legal distribution, but my attention drifted to the letter that still lay unfolded on the table. The paper seemed fragile, almost too delicate to carry the weight of the truth it contained. I could almost picture Grandpa sitting at his desk, his hand trembling slightly as he wrote each word, determined to leave behind not just money, but a message that would force his family to confront their own behavior. My aunt suddenly pushed her chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. "I want to hear that letter again," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Read the part where he talks about us." The lawyer hesitated for a moment before nodding. He lifted the letter once more and began reading the key sections again, this time with even more weight in the air. Hearing Grandpa's words repeated made them feel sharper, more deliberate, like a wound being reopened. As the years passed, I noticed that my presence in your lives became less important than the things I owned. My mother flinched visibly at that line. My father's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening, as if he were reliving every visit he had ever made to Grandpa's house, now seen through a lens he could no longer control. I do not write this to hurt you, but to explain why I had to make choices that some of you may find unfair. The word unfair seemed to echo in the room, lingering longer than the others. My aunt let out a bitter laugh. Unfair is exactly what this is, she snapped. He let his emotions cloud his judgment. Parents are supposed to be impartial. The lawyer lowered the letter. Your father was very clear that he did not believe impartiality meant ignoring the actions of his children. My father slammed his palm lightly on the table, the sound echoing in the small room. So he decided to shame us instead. To write a letter accusing us of being greedy and have it read out like some kind of public trial. No one answered him. There was no argument that could erase what had already been said. Grandpa's words were recorded, witnessed, and legally attached to his final wishes. I sat there, feeling like I was caught in the middle of a storm I had never asked to be part of. The looks my parents were giving me were no longer just shocked. They were wounded, resentful, and searching for someone to blame. And I could feel deep down that they had already decided that someone was me. The meeting ended soon after. The lawyer explained that the formal transfer of property and funds would take several weeks, during which he would handle the necessary paperwork. He offered his condolences once more and stood as we all gathered our things. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from tense anticipation to a thick, suffocating hostility. We walked out of the office in silence. The corridor felt narrower than before, the fluorescent lights harsher. My aunt muttered something under her breath to my mother, who nodded without looking at me. My father walked a few steps ahead, his shoulders stiff, his hands clenched at his sides. Once we were outside, the cool air hit my face. But it did little to ease the pressure building in my chest. I had barely taken a step toward the parking lot when my father turned around sharply. "What did you tell him?" he demanded. The question caught me off guard. What? What did you say to him to make him do this? He repeated, his voice rising. You were the only one around him all the time. You must have filled his head with stories about how we neglected him. I didn't say anything like that, I replied, my voice shaking despite my effort to stay calm. I just spent time with him. My mother stepped forward, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. Do you have any idea how this looks? People will think we abandoned him, and you swooped in to take everything. I didn't take anything, I insisted. He made his own decisions. My aunt crossed her arms. Convenient decisions for you. Their words felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. The grief I had been holding back since Grandpa's death suddenly mixed with a sharp, burning anger. For years, I had watched them ignore him, make excuses, and treat him like an obligation. Now that the consequences of their actions had been laid bare, they were acting as though I had orchestrated the entire situation. He wrote that letter himself, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You all heard it. He said why he did it. My father scoffed. Old people are easily influenced. You were there every day, playing the perfect granddaughter. Of course he felt closer to you. His words stung more than I expected. They turned something pure and genuine into something calculated and manipulative, twisting years of shared moments into a strategy for personal gain. I realized then that no matter what I said, they would never accept Grandpa's decision as anything other than a betrayal by him and by me. We drove home in silence. The car felt smaller than usual, the space between us filled with unspoken accusations. I stared out the window, watching the city blur past, and thought about how Grandpa had warned me that people would show sides of themselves I had never imagined. That evening, as I sat alone in my room, I unfolded a photocopy of the letter the lawyer had given me. I read it slowly, tracing the lines with my finger, as if doing so could somehow bring Grandpa back, even for a moment. His words were firm but not cruel, honest without being vicious. He had not written them to destroy his children, but to explain himself, to leave behind a truth he had been forced to keep quiet about while he was alive. The more I read, the clearer it became that the real destruction had not been caused by the letter itself. It had been caused by years of neglect, selfishness, and silence that had finally been exposed in a single, undeniable moment. Grandpa had not created the cracks in our family, he had simply shone a light on them. And now that the truth was out, there was no way to pretend those cracks didn't exist. The days after the will reading felt strangely quiet, as if the world had decided to carry on at its usual pace while my own life had been tipped off balance. Messages from relatives began arriving almost immediately, some disguised as condolences, others far less subtle in their curiosity. News traveled quickly through our extended family, and by the end of the week, everyone seemed to know that Grandpa had left most of his estate to me. My parents avoided speaking to me unless it was absolutely necessary. At home, conversations became clipped and practical, revolving around meals, bills, or errands, but never touching the subject that hovered between us like an uninvited guest. The silence was worse than shouting. It stretched through the house, thick and suffocating, making every shared room feel hostile. I continued visiting Grandpa's house during those days, partly to sort through his belongings and partly because it was the only place where I still felt a sense of peace. The familiar scent of his soap and old books lingered in the air, and for a few hours at a time, I could pretend he was just in another room, about to call out my name and ask for tea. One afternoon, as I sat at the dining table going through a stack of his letters, my phone buzzed. It was my mother. "When are you coming home?" she asked without greeting. "I'm finishing up here," I replied. "I'll be back in an hour." There was a pause before she spoke again. "Your father wants to talk to you. Properly." The word properly made my stomach tighten. I knew what that meant. The conversation they had been avoiding was finally coming. When I arrived home, both of them were sitting in the living room, waiting. The television was off, and the curtains were drawn halfway, casting the room in a dim, gray light. My father gestured for me to sit across from them, his expression unreadable. "We need to discuss the situation," he began, his voice calm but strained. "This inheritance, it's too much responsibility for someone your age." I folded my hands in my lap, already sensing where this was going. Grandpa trusted me to handle it. My mother leaned forward, her tone soft but urgent. "That's exactly why we're worried. You're still studying. You don't understand how to manage property, taxes, investments." "We do." The implication hung heavily in the air. They weren't offering help. They were positioning themselves as the rightful decision makers. "We think it would be best," my father continued, choosing his words carefully, "if you transferred the house to my name. That way, we can keep it in the family properly and make sure everything is handled correctly." For a moment, I just stared at him, unsure if I had heard correctly. The request felt surreal, as though we were discussing someone else's life, not my own. "Grandpa already kept it in the family," I said quietly. "He left it to me." My mother's patience began to crack. "He left it to you because you were there all the time. He was emotional, not practical. We're trying to fix a situation that was created by sentiment." Her words ignited a spark of anger that I had been suppressing since the day of the will reading. All the years of watching them ignore Grandpa, of hearing them talk about his house like it was a prize waiting to be claimed, rushed back in a wave of bitter clarity. "So you want me to give it to you?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay calm. "We want what's fair," my father replied. "You're our daughter. What's yours is part of this family." I let out a slow breath, trying to steady myself. "If that's true, then why wasn't Grandpa part of this family when he needed you?" The room fell silent. My mother's eyes widened, shocked that I had finally said what we had all been avoiding. "That's not fair," she said sharply. "We visited him, we called him." "You visited him when it was convenient," I replied, my voice growing steadier with each word. "You called him when you needed something. I was the one who stayed with him when he was sick. I was the one who took him to the doctor and made sure he ate. And now you're telling me his decision doesn't matter because it doesn't benefit you." My father's expression hardened. Watch your tone. We are still your parents. And he was still your father. I shot back before I could stop myself. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a long moment, no one spoke. I could see the conflict in my mother's face, anger battling with guilt, pride clashing with the uncomfortable truth she didn't want to face. My father stood up abruptly, pacing a few steps before turning back toward me. You're being ungrateful. Everything we've done for you, and now you're choosing money over your own family. The accusation stung, but it also clarified something deep inside me. They were not grieving the loss of their father. They were grieving the loss of what they believed they were entitled to. I'm not choosing money, I said quietly. I'm choosing to respect his last wishes. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was cold. If you don't fix this, you're going to tear this family apart. I felt a strange calm settle over me. For years, I had been afraid of conflict, afraid of disappointing them, afraid of being seen as the difficult daughter. But sitting there, hearing them reduce Grandpa's final act of gratitude to a problem that needed to be corrected, I realized that the family they were trying to protect had already been broken long before I ever inherited anything. I didn't tear anything apart, I said. He made his decision because of how things already were. Neither of them responded. The conversation ended not with resolution, but with a heavy, final silence that felt like a door closing. Over the following weeks, their behavior toward me grew colder. Small comments slipped into everyday conversations, remarks about responsibility, about how money changed people, about how some children forgot where they came from once they had power. Each one was a thinly veiled attempt to make me feel guilty, to push me into giving in without them having to ask again directly. But every time doubt crept into my mind, I would reread Grandpa's letter. His words were not just an explanation. They were a reminder that love was measured in actions, not in shared blood or social expectations. He had trusted me not because I was perfect, but because I had shown up when it mattered. One evening I returned to his house alone. The legal paperwork had been finalized, and the property was officially in my name. I walked through the quiet rooms slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of tables, the photographs on the walls. It felt strange knowing that this place, which had once belonged to the man who had raised my father, was now legally mine to protect or to leave behind. I stood for a long time in the backyard beneath the mango tree where we had spent so many evenings talking. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass. I could almost hear his voice in the rustle of the leaves, steady and gentle as always. For the first time since his death, I allowed myself to cry without holding back. I cried for the loss of the only person in my family who had ever made me feel completely understood. I cried for the anger and resentment that had taken root in my parents' hearts. And I cried for the realization that sometimes doing the right thing meant standing alone. When I finally wiped my tears and looked up at the darkening sky, I felt something shift inside me. The fear that had once kept me quiet, compliant, and desperate for approval was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. Grandpa's final gift had not just been financial security. It had been the courage to stop shrinking myself to keep others comfortable. I locked the house and stepped out onto the street, the cool evening air brushing against my face. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother, but I didn't open it right away. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to respond immediately, to smooth things over, to fix emotions that were never mine to manage. As I walked away from the house, the keys jingling softly in my hand, I understood what Grandpa had meant when he said people would show me sides of themselves I never imagined. They had, and it had hurt more than I could have prepared for. But in the process, they had also shown me my own strength. I wasn't the quiet granddaughter sitting in the corner anymore. I was someone who had been trusted with a legacy, not just of money or property, but of integrity. And for the first time, I felt certain that I would protect that legacy, even if it meant walking a path that my own family refused to follow.